Having received the emblems of chivalry, the second part of the investiture of the king begins, in which he is presented with the regalia, the emblems of majesty, culminating in St Edward's crown. The items that are required for this part of the ceremony were already laid down in the 14th century, and the way they will be delivered to the king on Saturday is in essence the way they were delivered to medieval kings, according to the ritual of the Liber Regalis. The purpose of the investing with the regalia, the emblems of majesty, and the crowning is twofold. Firstly, the purpose is to show the sovereign to be a transformed person. The theology of the coronation is that the king has been transformed into a consecrated sovereign by God by means of the anointing. See my videos on that. That he is now a new person, and he is dressed and presented to the people as that new person. The robes and regalia are a type of uniform. Like the vestments of church clergy, the intention is partly that they hide the man Charles, so that all you see is the king. Thus they emphasise symbolically the importance in our national life of the sovereign's office. The continuity of that office is more important than the character of the occupant of that office, and the fact that the king is wearing robes and holding regalia that is unchanged in nearly 1,000 years reflects that continuity. Secondly, it is to reinforce and remind the king himself, once again, of the purpose of the office he has entered. Again, it's not all about the king's personal prestige. With such a great office comes weighty responsibilities and difficult decisions. The heavy crown and the heavy robes, which you cannot easily move around in, are supposed to remind him of the real weight of his role and office. The other regalia is to remind him that he cannot act as a despotic king, but that he is to rule with sincerity, honesty, justice and mercy, and with consent and according to law. Although we have had kings in this country that have flirted with autocratic behaviour, they have usually come unstuck and they have destabilised the nation, for autocracy has long been distasteful to the English, who are too free-spirited. It has been the ability of most of our sovereigns to reign without being too autocratic that has ensured that Great Britain has evolved into a constitutional monarchy, and why we still have a medieval coronation. Once again, I remind viewers that the coronation ceremony, though of a British sovereign, is primarily an English medieval ceremony. The actual items of regalia, the symbols of majesty currently used, the armills, the orb, the sceptres and St Edward's crown, are not that old as far as the history of this ritual is concerned. They date from the restoration of the monarchy in 1661. They were commissioned by Charles II to replace the medieval English coronation regalia once kept in Westminster Abbey and destroyed by Parliament in 1649 after the English Civil War. Before destroying the regalia in 1649, the commissioners of Parliament, who were given the task of making a valuation of it, produced an inventory of them. When the commissioners were presented with the coronation regalia from Westminster Abbey, they found before them a very underwhelming group of artefacts. The King's coronation crown, St Edward's crown, which at the Reformation had been rebranded as the slightly more palatable King Alfred's crown to divorce it from association with St Edward's saintly cult, was not made of solid gold like the present crown, but of wirework with very slight stones set in it and two little bells hanging from it. It was valued at only a quarter of the value of the Tudor imperial state crown. The Queen's crown, Queen Edith's crown, was even meaner. It was made of silver gilt and was set with a few garnets, and it was valued at £10, whereas the Queen's state crown was worth 20 times that sum. There were various sceptres used in the coronation ceremony for the King and Queen, and rather than being of solid gold as the commissioners had hoped, they were made of cheaper materials. The sceptre with a dove was made of wood covered in silver gilt. Another sceptre, topped with a fleur-de-lis, was found to be of iron covered in silver gilt. A third was made of horn and silver gilt, and only one sceptre had any stones in it and any significant gold content, and even half of that was made of silver rather than gold. There was also a collection of garments worn by the king at the coronation, which are described as rich but worn out and very old. Many of these items, these garments and this regalia, were items associated with St Edward the Confessor, and the fact that they were made of less expensive materials than you might expect may indicate that they began their life as grave goods buried with the king. Charles II commissioned the new regalia from his banker Robert Viner in 1661, and it copied all the items in the previous regalia, at least in their form. But it was much more lavish than the set it replaced, and each piece of the present regalia is a fabulous example of English Baroque design and craftsmanship. Charles was determined that the newly restored monarchy that he was re-establishing would be a monarchy known for its pizzazz and splendour, and on Saturday we will see that pizzazz and splendour continued as the king is invested and crowned. So I want now to take you through the investiture with all this regalia bit by bit, discuss it with you, what it all symbolises, and how the ceremony this year might differ from previous coronations. Well, in the investiture, the king is first invested with what are called the armills, which are bracelets, and then what is now called the stole royal, a strip of fabric that looks a lot like a bishop or priest's vestment. The two items seem to have become confused, and up until 1953, the stole royal was called the armill, and that is because they were, it seems, the same object in the medieval period, and the stole was permanently attached in some way to the bracelets, so they both came to have the same name, a name that means bracelet. At some point the bracelets became detached and stopped being used, but until the coronation of George IV, the stole was still tied to the king's arms. The armills, made in 1661 to replace the medieval bracelets, are decorated in delicate enamel with the emblems of Great Britain, but they have never been used. In 1953, it was decided that some sense would be made of all of this, and new bracelets were made, which were called the armills, and the stole, which had gone by the name the armill, was from there on in called the stole royal. In 1953, new words were written to be read when the armills were imposed. The armills, so the new explanation stated, were the bracelets of sincerity and wisdom, and they were tokens of God's protection and a symbol of the bond between the sovereign and their people. For 2023, this text has now been shortened, and the idea that they represent a bond between the king and his people has been dropped. Elizabeth II wore the bracelets, but Charles III will not. He will touch them before they are then returned to the altar. The stole royal, which is placed on the king without any words being uttered, will be placed on King Charles by the Bishop of Durham, who is one of the bishop's assistants who flank him throughout the service. Now, after all the confusion with the armills and the stole, things get simpler after that. Then, on top of the other garments he's already wearing, the super tunica, etc., the king is vested with what is termed the robe royal. Traditionally, this vesting is done by the master or the mistress of the robes, depending on whether it's a male or female sovereign, with the aid of the Lord Great Chamberlain. But for Charles III's coronation, there has been much innovation as to who presents the regalia, with various peers and bishops being invited to perform the task, representing the various faith groups of the United Kingdom and the different Anglican churches. This time, the robe royal will be put on the king by Baroness Meron, who is of the Jewish faith, and she will be assisted by the Prince of Wales and the bishops. Now, traditionally, this is called the imperial robe, as it is of a form that was worn by the emperors of Byzantium. English kings from the 15th century onwards considered themselves to be so independent of outside power that they were, in effect, emperors in their own right, which is why this robe has traditionally had this title. but presumably because that is not well understood today, and anything with the word imperial has connotations of British colonialism, this time the Archbishop will say to the king, receive this robe rather than receive this imperial robe. As the robe is put on, the Archbishop prays that God might bestow on the king spiritual gifts, that he may be clothed with the robe of righteousness and the garments of salvation. The present robe, embroidered with emblems of the constituent kingdoms of the United Kingdom, the rose, the thistle and the shamrock, was made for the coronation of King George IV. After that, the final elements of the regalia are delivered. All were made by Robert Viner in 1661. First, the orb is delivered. This is a hollow gold globe that is decorated around the equator with a band of gems and is topped off with a cross. It is much grander than its medieval predecessor and weighs twice as much. The symbolism of the orb, which is an ornament that Byzantine emperors were invested with, is that Christ, the King of Kings, has authority over the whole world, and that, as the Archbishop of Canterbury will say, as the Anglican Archbishop of Armagh places it in the King's right hand, that all the kingdoms of the world are become the kingdoms of Christ. After it's presented to the King, the Archbishop of Armagh will retrieve it, and it's immediately taken back to the altar. It is then used for the procession out of the abbey at the end of the ceremony. Then the sovereign is traditionally invested with a ring. In times past, it was one of their own rings in the care of the Master of the Jewel House, and it was presented to the Archbishop by the Master of the Jewel House. This time, the ring will be presented by Lord Patel, a Scottish Knight of the Order of the Thistle and a Hindu. Since the coronation of Edward VII in 1902, the sovereign has worn a ring that was made for William IV at his coronation, and it is placed on the fourth finger of the right hand, which was the finger that medieval people in the West wore their wedding rings on. I'm Orthodox, and we still do that. The ring is made from gold, with sapphires, rubies and diamonds, the rubies set in the form of a cross, so that the whole thing forms the shape of the Union flag. The king, it seems, will not wear the ring this year, but simply acknowledge it and then send it back to the altar. Prior to this coronation, the ring signified the seal of Catholic faith and was a reminder for the king to defend the church. This year, the meaning of the ring has been changed entirely. The Archbishop will say that it is a symbol of kingly dignity, and like a wedding ring, is a sign of a covenant, of the promises that the king has made both to God and to his people. Then a white glove is presented, which the king will wear on his right hand. Traditionally, this was provided by and presented to the king by the Lord of the Manor of Worksop in Nottinghamshire, who was for many centuries the Duke of Newcastle. In 1953, because the then Duke had placed all his land holdings into a limited company, he wasn't allowed to present the glove, and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster presented it to the late Queen instead. However, in 1937, the then Duke of Newcastle did present the glove to George VI. Now, King Charles has chosen to use that glove presented by Newcastle to his grandfather, and the glove of white kid leather has the arms of the Dukes of Newcastle on the back of it. This year, the glove will be presented by a Sikh peer, Lord Singh of Wimbledon. The glove has traditionally been presented without words, but some have been invented for this coronation. May you hold authority with gentleness and grace, the Archbishop will say, trusting not in your own power, but in the mercy of God, who has chosen you. Then the sceptres are presented. There are two sceptres. The first is called the sceptre with the cross, and it was made in 1661, though it was altered both in 1820 and in 1910. The major alteration in 1910 was so that it could contain the largest stone cut from the Cullinan diamond, Cullinan 1. This is the largest uncoloured cut diamond in the world. The second sceptre has a couple of names. It is known either as the rod with the dove or the rod of equity and mercy. The sceptre with the cross is, as the Archbishop says, the ensign of kingly power and justice, and it represents the king's authority over the secular realm. The rod of equity and mercy is a symbol of covenant and peace, and symbolised the king's role as a merciful ruler and also as the protector of the church. The dove on the top represents the Holy Spirit. This year, the Archbishop of Wales and the Primus of the Episcopal Church in Scotland will deliver these sceptres into the king's hands, the sceptre with the cross going into the king's gloved right hand. It will also be used in the procession out of the abbey with the orb. The Archbishop will exhort the king to exercise authority with wisdom, to direct his counsel with grace, and through service and ministry to his people to ensure justice and mercy prevail. The sceptres are a reminder again to the king, as the sword was, of his great responsibility as sovereign. The king is now ready for his crowning. The king will be crowned with St Edward's crown, made in 1661 by Robert Viner for Charles II, which was not being used all that much for the purpose in the course of history. From the reign of George I until the coronation of Edward VII, sovereigns were crowned with the state crown. George V and all subsequent sovereigns have used St Edward's crown again. If you want more detail about the crown itself and its making, I have 2 videos all about it. Traditionally at this point, the Archbishop goes to the altar and he lifts up the crown, he blesses it and prays for God's blessing on the sovereign. Then he hands it to the Dean, who then takes it to St Edward's chair. The Archbishop then takes it and places it upon the king's head. But this time, the Dean will bring the crown to the Archbishop, and the Archbishop will bless it in front of the king before placing it on the king's brow. As the Archbishop of Canterbury lays this extraordinary crown on the king's head, he says, "God save the king," and the assembled company of the abbey also cry, "God save the king." The bells of the abbey will ring, the guns in the royal parks will be fired, and there will be then a pause and then a fanfare. It will be a spine-tingling moment. There the king will sit in that ancient chair, robed and crowned like a Byzantine emperor, and like his many forebears who have sat in that historic place, a vision of splendour and of majesty. Thanks very much for watching. I've decided to publish a special Coronation issue of the Antiquary magazine. This is an addition to the general monthly issue. I have a large collection of really interesting old photographs that I've been collecting over the years of the coronations of George V, George VI and Elizabeth II, and to celebrate the King's coronation in May, this issue will be a special album looking back at the coronations of the 20th century. There is a link in the description and above to the website where you can pre-order a copy before the publishing date in early May.